As I was reflecting on finding hope, I thought about all the years that I have been pastoring. It's funny how it works, but the older I get, the longer I've been pastoring. And one of my principles is always, as a pastor, to leave people with hope. No matter what else is going on, no matter what else I'm preaching about, we always say to one another, you got to leave them with hope. Some days that's harder than others. So when I called the sermon Finding Hope, there have been times in my life that I've really had to look for it. Sometimes that was on my knees early Sunday morning, still looking for hope. Hope is part of the Christian triad, faith, hope, and love. I think we get confused about what hope is because of the way that we use it in our common language and vocabulary. We say things like, I hope, fingers crossed. I hope this works out. I've been struck for years by T.S. Eliot's reflection on hope from his poem, East Coker. I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope. For hope would be wrong, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. Yet there is faith, but the faith and the love are all in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. So darkness shall be the light, and the stillness the dancing. I think as I inch toward my Medicare birthday, I'm finally beginning to understand what T.S. Eliot meant. I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope, because hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Because for so often, our hope means we want everything to be all right. Am I alone in this? We want everything to just be all right. But the reality of life, the sometimes harsh truth of what life serves up, doesn't end all right. One of my favorite movies is The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. And remember the ever-optimistic Kapoor? Everything will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, then it's not the end. And now I love his cheery attitude. But I don't know if it's true at some level. This week I listened to a podcast by Kate Dicamillo. She's an author. She wrote the books. Maybe some of you are familiar with Because of Winn-Dixie, The Tales of Despereaux, The Magician's Elephant. And she says in this podcast about her friend and talks about Charlotte's Web. Now, how many of you have read Charlotte's Web or at least know? Okay, great. Just reminding you, Wilbur the pig, Charlotte the spider, right? You with me? Okay. So here's what she says. My childhood best friend read Charlotte's Web over and over again as a kid. She would read the last page, turn the book over, and begin again. A few years ago, I asked her why. What made you read and reread that book, I asked her. Did you think that if you read it again, things would turn out differently? Things would turn out better, that Charlotte wouldn't die? And her friend said, no, it wasn't that. I kept reading it not because I wanted it to turn out differently or thought that it would turn out differently, but because I knew for a fact that it wasn't going to turn out differently. I knew that a terrible thing was going to happen, and I also knew that it was going to be okay somehow. I thought that I couldn't bear it, but then when I read it again, it was all so beautiful, and I found out that I could bear it. That was what the story told me. That was what I needed to hear, that I could bear it somehow. Maybe that's the beginning of understanding hope, that we can bear it somehow, whatever the it is in our particular life at this moment. That's why I love that the quote by Howard Zinn that Sebastian read for us so beautifully. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. And listen to what he says. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. What we choose to emphasize. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently. Don't you love that? When people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live in defiance of all that is bad around us is itself a marvelous victory. What we choose to emphasize. In the midst of COVID, in the midst of climate change, in the midst of Ukraine, what we choose to emphasize. The list of good things. I saw a young man from Norway on CNN last night. And he came to the Poland-Ukrainian border, and he drives an ambulance, and he goes in, and he gets people, and he brings supplies, and he brings people back across the border. He does this day after day because he saw it on the news, and he said, I just have to do something. And the interviewer said, are you willing to die for this? And he said, yes, I am. I think about the Harvard teenagers who built a website practically overnight that hooks people up with places to stay. I think about the thousands of Airbnb owners who have offered their places free to refugees. I hope this sets a great precedent, because not all refugees have been treated as well, shall we just say. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. The good things like Russians protesting against the war at the peril of being imprisoned. The people who help migrants crossing the parched desert by putting their own lives at risk by going out and putting water in places where people can get to it along the route. The World Central Kitchen on the border of Poland, cooking thousands yummy meals, thousands of them. Can you imagine, as a refugee fleeing Ukraine, what it must be like to sit down and have a hot meal that is delicious, made by someone for you? What do you see? Three weeks ago, when folks here so beautifully did a prayer service for Ukraine, and people wrote different things. Chase wrote something about grief, and it has stuck with me. What do you see with the open window? And she said in that reading, be assured that in all situations, at all times of crisis, there are moments of rest and safety. There are strange graces that fly to meet us. And so I think part of hope is saying, be assured that in the very face of evil itself, that goodness is there. Goodness brought into sharp relief against what is going on. So right now there is goodness in all pockets of whatever tragedy, whatever situation. There is somebody helping an elderly person to a bomb shelter. There is someone scooping up a child and helping a mother. There is someone tending to someone's wounds at the risk of their own injury. There is goodness. And I think what I have come to realize is that we have to be able to hold heartbreak and hope at the same time. Are you with me so far? Can't quite tell. Okay. That's why I love this Lazarus story. It's a traditional Lenten story. It has heartbreak and hope. It faces unflinchingly the inevitability of death, the inescapability of suffering and loss. And yet, there are strange graces that fly in this story. When Jesus arrives, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And Martha runs out to meet him and says, Lord, if you had been here, if only you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't be in the despair that I'm in. Mary comes later and basically says the same thing. In the midst of heartbreak. And then Jesus himself begins to weep. And the word here, weep, is not just have a tear roll down one's eyes. The word here means racking sobs, the kind of grief that bends you over. In the midst of that heartbreak, there becomes hope. In the midst of a very situation, Lord, you can't raise him. He's been there 4 days. It won't be pretty. In the midst of messy situations. And Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. And he does. And then the community just looks at him. And then Jesus says, hey, friends, get to work. Get to work. Unbind him. Because only together do we bring hope alive. Now, I know that people don't come back to life in the same way that Lazarus came back to life. But people come back to life. People come back to life after terrible situations. People come back to life when they rise out of depression. People come back to life when they didn't think they could take one more step, but they do. People come back to life when they don't think they'll ever heal from an injury, they'll ever get well from a diagnosis, but they do. People come back to life when they get in recovery and stop drinking. People come back to life when they've had debilitating grief, but find a way to love again. People come back to life out of death-dealing situations every day. At the end of the podcast, Kate Dicamillo says this. My favorite lines of Charlotte's Web, the lines that always make me cry, are toward the end of the book, and they go like this. These autumn days will shorten and grow cold. The leaves will shake loose from the trees and fall. Christmas will come, then the snows of winter. You will live to enjoy the beauty of the frozen world, for you mean a great deal to Zuckerman, and he will not harm you ever. Winter will pass, the days will lengthen, the ice will melt in the pasture pond. The song sparrow will return and sing, the frogs will awake, the warm wind will blow again. All these sights and sounds and smells will be yours to enjoy, Wilbur. This lovely world, these precious days. Dicamillo says, I have tried for a long time to figure out how E.B. White did what he did, how he told the truth and made it bearable. And then she said, the only answer I could come up with was love. E.B. White loved the world. And in loving the world, he told the truth about it. Its sorrow, its heartbreak, its devastating beauty. He trusted his readers enough to tell them the truth. And with that truth came comfort and a feeling that we were not alone. Like E.B. White, our job is to love the world. To love the world as it is, with its heartbreak, with its sorrow, with its precious gifts and its devastating beauty. Kind of the way that we try to love people. Heartbreak is facing the reality of the world. But finding hope is engaging that world with love. In those loving acts, hope comes alive. In those loving acts, yes, the world is transformed, but more importantly, we are transformed. And then we are reminded, you are not alone. That there is always goodness, and that you can be part of it. That there is goodness in you. That you can, in the midst of everything, cry for the sorrow, but also feel your eyes fill up with tears because of the beauty of the world and the preciousness of life. You can rejoice in the gift of life itself, and that you get a chance to experience love. Heartbreak and hope. Amen.